So, just a warm welcome on my behalf. I'm Jaana Sinipuro. I'm a project director at Citra's Fair Data Economy project, and I also a former steering board member at MyData Global. So I'm sure that you will really enjoy this session today, and I'm really honored that we have these two great speakers with us today, Primavera de Filippi and Catherine D'Ignazio. And I'm sure that's going to be quite inspiring, because we often talk about data science, and we talk about science and we think about science, but in fact, it's quite biased. So there's lots of perceptions, there's lots of our own concepts, our own values that affect on the use of data and how we develop data science. So hopefully after this session, you will have a lot more insight and be more aware of the ways we used to think about data. So with further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. We will hear first two perfect presentations, and then we will have a dialogue session afterwards and some panel discussions. So be active on generating the questions through the Kiko chat, so that we can have a very interactive and good sessions. But now I would like to introduce Primavera de Filippi, who's the permanent researcher at the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris, a faculty associate at the Bachman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Her research focuses on legal challenges and opportunities of blockchain and artificial intelligence, with specific focus on governance and trust. Those are very topical issues nowadays. So we will hear some interesting views about different metaphors, narratives we use for data. Please, floor is yours, Primavera.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so basically what I would like to discuss with this presentation is really looking at the different ways in which we have been talking about data, what are the different narratives, the different analogies, and connecting this with the way in which, like, what is the power of those analogies is that not only they have this descriptive flavor, which is like, here is how we can perceive data, but they also have like a performative element to them, because the way in which we look at data and the way in which we understand data will also affect the way in which we decide to regulate this type of these resources. So I'm going to go through different analogies, and for each one of those analogies, I'm going to try and show to the extent to which they are useful and the extent to which they are limited, because of course data is data, and every analogy will always be, like, to some extent imperfect. So what is data? So one strong analogy that we hear a lot is data as capital. And we can see this because indeed, like, more and more we're noticing that we oftentimes pay for our services through our data, in the sense that we get free access to a service in exchange of providing a lot of data to the platform operator. And there is really this vision of, like, so data as a mechanism that as a resource that needs to be accumulated, as a system that the more you have, the more you can invest into it, and the more you can build upon it and create even more data and so forth. So there is really this capitalistic vision of data as a resource, that the more data you have, the more data you can create, and which leads to those accumulative tendencies towards data. Now, of course, this analogy also comes with a few limitations. First and foremost, that as opposed to traditional forms of, like, money and capital, data is actually not a unit of account. And so actually we don't really know what is the value that we are providing and how much are we paying for those services which are purchasing through our data. And secondly, also, data is not really, it's not something that is not able to. It's
Shall I share my screen?
Yeah, please do. And while you are sharing, I can introduce you just briefly that you are an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and director of the Data Feminism Lab, as we can see. But I really liked your definition, your short bio, saying that you're a hacker mama, scholar, and artist designer who drives on the feminist technology. So welcome. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I hope we'll get Primavera back really shortly as well.
Yeah. Otherwise, we will have a very long and rich discussion, dialogue.
So yeah, thank you. I'm really honored to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation to be at this conference with you all. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the motivations for writing this recent book that my colleague Lauren Klein and I have written called Data Feminism. Because in fact, in a way, the book is a pushback against a very particular narrative or story that we tell, or that we meaning not me, but other people tell about data. So what I want to do just in this short presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about our motivations for writing data feminism, and about kind of like what stories we want to elevate, and what metaphors we want to use, because our metaphors are meaningful, and they attract and exclude certain types of people depending on how we deploy them. And so just briefly to say a couple of things, this is a very collaborative work. So this is also with Lauren Klein, who is down in Atlanta at Emory University. And then there's a URL on this slide, datafeminism.io. The book is actually open access, so you can go and read it online for free. And it's openly available. And so you just go to that link and click read now, and it'll take you to the book. So we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's trying to hold corporate and government actors accountable for basically making racist, sexist, and classist data products. And so these are things folks are probably familiar with, the folks who are attending this conference. There are things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote women's resumes, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, and many more things. And so you can see some of the recent work, and actually the work that was inspiring us as we were writing Data Feminism is here, like Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, Virginia Eubanks, Maggie Walter, Julia Angwin, and the Algorithmic Justice League. And, but these things, these stories, these media stories about bias and racism and sexism in these data products keep coming out. So there's a couple examples here. We've recently seen an algorithm to predict A-level exam grades, and then it used students' geographic location as an input into the system. And so students in under-resourced areas found that their exam grades were artificially lowered. So essentially they were penalized for where they live. Another woman found that she was needed to shine a very bright light on her face because she had dark skin, because she had to sit for the bar exam for 2 days, and the face detection system could not see her face without her shining a very bright, hot light on her face for 2 days. And so the fact that these examples keep coming out, and also that we keep talking about them as algorithmic bias instead of oppression, which is sort of what they really are, is what motivated us to write this book. And in a way, we can really consider the book a kind of a pushback against a meme that has been circulating for a very long time at this point about data, which you can see here on this slide. Data is the new oil. I'm sure folks have heard this before. This has been in circulation since at least 2006. It's been amplified by The Economist magazine, which had a big issue sort of claiming this in a variety of ways. It's been amplified by lots of global CEOs and so on, who are trying to create a value proposition for data. And the metaphors here, and we should just take a minute to unpack this particular metaphor. The metaphor here is that data is a raw natural resource like oil. It's something that we can mine, it's something we can process, and it's something we can transform and clean and refine. And once we do all those steps, then it will yield truly fantastic and extraordinary profits, financial profits. And so, just thinking about this, we need to sort of deconstruct this and ask, the feminist perspective is always ask, for whom? And we could ask that question of oil, and we can ask that question of data. So I just want to note that this is a metaphor that's very white, it's very Silicon Valley, it's very heteropatriarchal, it's very techno-heroic, it's colonial, it's extractive, it's unsustainable. Again, kind of like even this comparison of something that is sort of natural out there, waiting for us to tame and dominate it so that we can then extract and exploit it. This is a violent metaphor. And just as oil has done violence, data is doing violence right now. And so, where we sort of situate data feminism is within this pushback that I was talking about. And this is a pushback that's been happening, it's always been happening. But in particular, the last, I would say 5 years have been really exciting for scholars and activists who are starting to push back against really the harms of big tech and extractive data practices. And so what these authors, academics, activists say in a whole variety of ways, ranging from like art and poetry to very detailed sort of ethnographic studies to quantitative audits, what they say is data is the same old oppression. And it's interesting to see like where is this pushback coming from? Who is this pushback coming from? It's being led by Black and Indigenous women of color, by white women, by Indigenous people, by immigrant communities, by LGBTQ communities, and many more folks who are, essentially saying, this is the same, we're doing the same thing. We're keeping the world in the same state as before. It's just that we're using data and algorithmic systems to accelerate and exacerbate the same social inequalities that have existed for hundreds of years. And so what we bring to this conversation, because I think it is an ongoing conversation, there are many folks involved from many different perspectives. What we bring is a focus on feminism. And so we like to sort of unpack what that word means, because people bring different histories. And in fact, there are many sort of versions of feminism. They're not always compatible with each other. So we like to be very specific on what we think a feminist approach to data and technology can add. So first of all, the feminist is the person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this is that feminism is a belief in equality. So it's a belief. But secondly, if you believe that we should have equality for all the genders, you just have to look around and see that that belief is not realized in this present world. We see that in many ways, in data-driven ways and interpersonal ways, like wage gaps, gender-based violence, discrimination, and so on. So feminism implies that if we want to realize that world of equal rights, we have to take action. So feminism is organized activity on behalf of that world that we want to see. And then finally, feminism is also this really rich intellectual heritage. And this is sometimes what folks don't realize, is that we have hundreds of years of thinking about inequality, starting with sex and gender as the sort of focus for analyzing inequality and power differentials in the world. But the past 40 years of scholarship and the present reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the equation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and so many more things. So this is this like tremendous intellectual heritage that we can borrow from and use in order to face our present moment, where we have all these ethical conundrums and dilemmas. And so then the most important takeaway from this definition of feminism is that feminism in the year 2020 must be understood as being intersectional. So this is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who's here on the bottom right. And she used this to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference. So we can't only reflect on social inequality just by looking at gender. We have to really be considering the intersection of the many forces and factors that produce inequality. So sexism, yes, racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. And her point is that these things compound and intersect to produce really highly differential effects, and effects that are nonlinear for these different populations who live at the intersections. And we all live at intersections. And so it's really Crenshaw, and then she follows in a long line of Black feminist thinkers. The intersectionality is really an idea out of Black feminism. And it's an idea that actually has been around for a very long time, even though it's really only starting to become mainstream now. So finally, just to wrap up, in today's world, data is power. So, if we're, actually I should say, like, so what intersectional feminism calls our attention to is power. Like, it's not just about women. It's not just even about gender. It's about really looking at power and analyzing power. And so today's world, data is power, right? We see that in this very material sense, in the sense that it is producing just extraordinary amounts of financial gain for the folks that have the resources to collect, store, maintain, analyze, deploy, et cetera. But it's tremendously unequally distributed, that power. And so the main point of the book is this idea that intersectional feminism, when we apply it to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And so in a sense, our argument is that data science needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to truly challenge these power imbalances. And I would say, if we ever hope for data science to do good, we have to be really serious about incorporating an analysis of power and a more specific definition of good, probably, than we are currently using. And yeah, so just finally, one of our aspirations for the book is that we not just kind of, there is a lot of work right now that's kind of pushing back, and this is very important work, but we are ourselves sort of makers and doers and users of data science, designers of data visualizations. So we really came from the standpoint of, like, how do we use a different set of values in our work? And so that's why we have these 7 principles of data feminism. This is also how the book is structured. And so each chapter sort of details one of these principles. It introduces the feminist thinkers that have led to the formulation of the principle. And then it shows you through examples and stories, folks who are really already doing this in their work. So they're already examining power. They're already rethinking binaries. They're already elevating emotion and embodiment in data science. And part of that is just to say that, like, this is possible. It is possible to do data science like this, even though it is definitely not the norm at this point. So maybe I will stop it there, and I'm happy to, give examples of these principles later in the conversation and talk further about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Very insightful. And I think we will give floor back to Primavera, but just a quick question. When we were preparing for this session, I saw that actually you were kind of born digital. Your father, Fred Ignazio, was well known as pioneer in multimedia education. So do you think that we, in order to be so conscious about data, how well equipped we need to be, and who has responsibility of explaining these biases with data?
Sure. Yeah, you should go. I appreciate that you went and checked out my dad's Wikipedia page. And it's true, like I was born digital. I was in computer camp when I was doing programming of computers when I was like in 4th grade. And it was very normal to have computers and robots around my house growing up. And I do think that's partially why I ended up where I ended up. But yeah, I think actually what we need is a more of like an intersection. I talk about this often in terms of like how we educate computer scientists and how we educate folks is like, I think actually we need we need to revalue what we value in technology. So a lot of times what's valued in fields like computer science is technical mastery, largeness, hugeness, abstractions, generalizability, scalability. Those are actually things that are working against us if we really aspire to connect technology meaningfully to the social world. But there are these fields that can provide a lot of insight into how to do that well. And so those are humanities and social sciences fields. And so, I think in fact, what we need is a much more sort of holistic dialogue to help us revalue work, and in particular, revalue work that's sort of socio-technical in nature, rather than, there's a place for just purely technical innovation, of course, but we really need to think about when these technologies are employed in social context with human beings. If we are designing those things only for a profit motive, only to benefit the big companies, like there are huge harms that are going to ensue. And that's just basically what we're seeing come up every single day right now, is there's huge gaps in what computer science is accountable for and knows how to do. Like they need help, basically. Mm-hmm. And so I think that help can come through these more holistic conversations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's hope that Primavera is now having a good connection. And let's introduce her again. And she's been studying, I wrote an article about big data and big responsibilities. So it will be interesting now to continue with her view on legislation. So please, Primavera, floor is yours if you can share your screen, and probably start from the beginning, because it was a little vague, the line, since the very start of your presentation.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So actually, it is really nice to start to go after Catherine, because I think she gave a very good introduction for what I want to talk about, which is essentially like, given that data is power, then how can we govern it? Like, what are the different ways in which we can leverage this data, but also how can we manage and control the way in which it is being used and reused. And so in this presentation, I will provide like a series of analogies to data, and look at how different analogies might lead to, because we understand data in a different manner, might lead to actually regulate and govern this data also in a different manner. And of course, every analogy has its own advantage and drawbacks, and so I will go through each one of them. So the first analogy is data as capital, meaning that we see data as this thing that is like an investment, that is like something that we need to accumulate, and the more we accumulate data, the more we can produce data, and then there is like this constant strive towards concentrating as much data as possible in order to produce value. The limitation of this analogy though is that so data is not a unit of account, and so even though it is true that we are increasingly paying for online services with data, we actually don't understand the value of this data. We don't actually know what is the benefit that we're giving the online operator and what is the cost for us. And then secondly, data is not really, as opposed to capital in the traditional sense, which is a mean of production, data is not itself a mean of production. It's just like a particular resources that can be amplified. And so a secondary narrative, an alternative metaphor that is perhaps slightly more accurate, and this is the one of like data as the new oil, but more generally data as raw material. And so we get into data mining, and we get into these tendencies towards like data extraction data exploitation and appropriation, in the idea that whatever data we have extracted and we have mined becomes our own data that we can freely exploit. And so this is obviously a very strong narrative that is commonly used in the vocabulary. At the same time, it's kind of not necessarily correct, because on the one hand, like data as raw material really means that data exists in the environment and that people can just freely extract and exploit it, whereas most of the data today is actually produced. It's produced by users, it's produced by platforms. It's not something that exists and that is around us. It's also something that needs to be made, needs to be curated, etc. And the second one, which is perhaps the most important limitation to this analogy, is the non-rivality. So raw material is by definition scarce, and so it gets consumed in order to create new resources, whereas data is this non-rival resource that is abundant and that you can use and reuse and share without actually preventing other people from also using it. And so a third analogy that is recently gaining traction is the vision of data as labor. And the idea here is to actually account for the fact that data is being produced. It's not something that just exists. It's something that is mostly produced by user interaction on those online platforms. And so if users are actually data producers, then we are actually exploiting them because we are not remunerating them for this labor. And so most of the data that is currently benefiting those online platforms is actually, if data is labor, then it has to be qualified as unpaid labor. So this is a strong narrative because indeed it actually recognizes the fact that users and people are inherently part of the process of data production. But at the same time, it has some problems because, well, first of all, not all data is actually produced by users. There's a lot of metadata that is automatically generated by computers. But also there is this thing of like, what does it mean if I produce data, but this data also relates to other people because I'm interacting with other people, and so should I be paid for the work of producing or collecting data that is actually qualified as the personal data of someone else, or should that other person be paid for, but they didn't do the work, I did the work of producing this data? And finally, there is this question of work for hire. So the idea that whenever you're an employee of a firm and you do the work, then automatically the output of this work is belonging to the firm. And so in that case, that will mean that by definition, any data that is issued from this labor that has been remunerated will be automatically under the exclusive control of those online operators. An alternative narrative is the idea of data as property. And so currently we do have, at least in Europe, a limited version of that in terms of database. We have this sui generis right on the protection of database. The problem is that it doesn't actually, it's not a property right on data itself. It's actually a right that is around the data, but it's mostly around the extensive utilization and reuse and extraction of this data. And so the data itself is not protected by property. And so this narrative goes with the underlying premise that because the data is valuable and because many people are benefiting from this data, then we should actually turn it into some kind of property asset so that I can sell my data and I can get remunerated, and then this data can be resold to other actors. And so it has some kind of saliency in terms of like, we need to provide value, we need to give value where a value can be extracted. But it also has this very problematic thing of alienability, which means that once I have sold my data, then I lose control. I have no longer the possibility of preventing or even influencing the way in which this data will be used by the owner. And again, it also has the problem of like, what does it mean if I collect, like if there is now a market for data, I will be incentivized to go and collect as much data as possible, perhaps personal data of third parties, and sell it. And then because I'm the one selling it, I will be the one remunerated for it. And that might be unfair to the other people that actually are concerned with this data. Another analogy, another metaphor is more Hegelian vision of data as an extension of the self, which is actually the narrative that is currently used, at least in continental Europe, to justify this like inalienable right to privacy, data protection, and this vision of consent, meaning that we cannot actually sell our data. We cannot just consent for the use of this data, but the consent can always be revoked because if we feel that this is actually impinging upon our persona, then we should be able to prevent this type of utilization. So again, this is a strong narrative, but it also comes with some drawbacks in the sense that, first of all, there is the possibility of anonymizing data, and so we don't really know whose extension of the self it is. There is also the thing about all this data that is actually non-sensitive or non-personal data that cannot qualify as the extension of the self. And then there is the question of the public good, meaning that in some specific cases, and if it is personal data, then there might be a general interest, there might be a public interest for actually accessing and processing this data because of a greater good, which might be research, which might be health, public national security, and so forth. And so an alternative to this vision is actually expanding the scope of data as not just an extension of the self, but as actually a network of social relationship. And in that case, it's not just about being a personal inalienable right, but it's actually a collective right. And that has two consequences. On the one hand, it means that I should not be able to unilaterally license or transfer or alienate a particular piece of data, because this data is a network relation, and this data is communicating so much information about everyone around me, whether it's my genetic data that is actually communicating information about my siblings and my parents, whether it's like all the information about my communications, which is actually also giving information about who I'm speaking to and who is speaking to me. And so on the one hand, it shouldn't be allowed that only one person can actually decide when to license or when to provide consent for the processing of those data. And on the other hand, it also that collectively there might be a desire to actually let this data be accessible for specific general interest purposes. And so this means that data cannot be governed on an individual level. It has to be governed on a collective and therefore democratic level, because it is a social relationship, because it is like involving so many people at the same time. And then finally, an alternative narrative, which is less popular, mostly because it has not been fully explored yet, I think, is data as infrastructure. And here the idea is that data has become this kind of essential facility. Like, we do need data in order to do anything today. And this is especially visible in the context of AI, in which like we are seeing that more and more AI-based systems are actually trained on huge amount of data, and we need this data in order to make competitive AI system. And so the essential facility doctrine is based on like an antitrust policy, which is like when there is a particular infrastructure which is essential for providing a particular service, this infrastructure needs to be shared. And then the question is like, so are we at a point in which today, when we have like Google, Facebook that have just so much amount of data, no one else can actually compete with this platform, because no one can actually train AI, no one can build systems that are so sophisticated, not because of the lack of technicalities, but because of the lack of data. And so the question becomes, can we actually rely on this antitrust doctrine in order to ensure that our competitors have access, can actually use those huge data sets in order to train their systems and in order to actually develop added value services. And so again, this is like, I think this is a very interesting thing, especially given the centrality that like data is power. And so those who have the data have the power. And so how can we actually share this power? And so the interesting thing here is like, if we see data as infrastructure, then of course there needs to be a particular infrastructure that is designed for data sharing, because we don't just want to share data in any possible way. And so what are the specific characteristics that such an infrastructure needs to have? So one is it needs to account for these essential facilities. So we should not share all data, but we should share data when it is necessary for the public good. It should also ensure that data never gets alienated, that the people concerned with this data always maintain control over the data flow. It should also not be exploitative, meaning that it should actually provide a proper retribution for the data that is provided. And then finally, ideally, there is no single point of failure and control, meaning that we don't centralize all this information into one single place, because that means that this one actor will have way too much control, but also that it's a potential point of attack. And so in order to actually understand how to design this infrastructure, it might be useful to actually look at what are the core characteristics of data assets. So one is the exponentiality, meaning that there is actually an incentive to aggregate as much data together because the overall value of the data set will increase because of the network effect in an exponential manner the more data actually has been collected. But on the flip side of that, because of the social relationship of data, we also need to be careful about correlation and triangulation, because as more and more data gets aggregated together, it becomes possible to actually identify, infer, or deduce information about authors that did not consent to the treatment of their own data. We also have the non-rivalry, so data as opposed to traditional physical assets wants to be free because it's actually non-rival and it can be, it's abundant, it's not based on exclusivity and scarcity, and actually focusing too much on recreating this artificial scarcity might lead to an under-exploitation of this data. And so we have like all the ideas about open data, and this has been quite successful, at least like at the public sector information. But it's very difficult to actually get open data to be adopted in the private sector because basically the idea is that it would lead to the unfair exploitation of this information. So someone is opening up their data and then everyone else can create added value services without having done the initial investment of collecting this data. And so as opposed to the open data, which is free use and free dissemination of data, there is this concept of data commons that is emerged, which is actually like enclosing, like opening up, but only to a particular group of people, which here, this is like the general vision of what ideally
Primavera, we are losing you again. Maybe are you close enough to your mic? Just when it's becoming more and more interesting.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, there are many ways in which, like, there are many approaches to this sharing data infrastructure. There is AI Commons, which is an initiative that is trying to create like this common-based centralized data store of data that will be used by people that join this consortium in order to train their machine learning models, right? And so the idea is that people that joins the pool will put all the data into the pool, and then anyone can submit requests and basically use them in order to improve the training of their own AI algorithm. And so it's nice because it has this collective and common-based approach, but it's also centralized. And so it means that we need to trust who is the people that are managing this data, and that they're not like peeking into it, that they're not like leaking it and so forth. And then there is like alternative approach. So there is open-minded, which is actually relying on secure trusted data store. So everyone actually maintain their own data store for data, but then they actually use federated learning and differential privacy in order to enable people to actually go and train their algorithm by federating this information, but the information remains stored separately into every single data store. And so here the interesting thing is that there is also a mechanism of reward. So there is an incentive for people to join the system. And as the AI algorithm improve, the amount of improvement that they get from having trained themselves in a particular pod, then they will be rewarded accordingly. And then more sophisticated, perhaps, and still experimental, is like all those mechanisms of like secure multi-party computation and homomorphic encryption, where actually all the data is actually distributed. There is no There is no one centralized system. There is not a federated system of data store. It's actually a completely decentralized network that relies on cryptographic technique in order to enable those AI systems to be trained without ever actually anyone having access to the raw data. And so we can actually share the benefit of the data being aggregated without actually incurring the cost of potentially leaking or disclosing sensitive information. And then by using a blockchain-based system for access control, it is possible to actually reward everyone that is a this data. So creating an ever greater gravitational center in data for the actual benefit. And so all this
the connection is bad again.
The data itself. And so what this leads to is that we have accessible data without neither disclosure nor the alienation of the control over the data. We benefit from the aggregation and the network effect without losing with the concentration of power. And then we also benefit from the possibility of retributing people who contribute the data based on the actual amount of improvement and the quality of the data that they provide, while reducing the problems of having a single point of failure. And so just to conclude, when we talk about data governance, we really need to think about not just it's not just about the law, it's not about we regulate data. It's not also just about the infrastructure. It's not just about the technicalities of it. It's also about what is the economic model around it and what are the social norms that goes along with it. And we really need to, when we think about data governance, we really need to encompass all those 4 layers, all those 4 levels, in order to actually create a mechanism, an infrastructure for data sharing that is actually that respect privacy, that is technically sound, and that is not leading to surveillance, that provides economic incentives for people to contribute data, and also, of course, that is consistent with the social norm of society. And so, of course, there is not one single way to do it. There is a lot of possible ways, and we just need to find what is the right narrative, what is the one that speaks to us, but also what is the narrative that will lead to trying to construct the best infrastructure around this type of data. That's it for now.
Okay. Thank you, Primavera. I would invite now, if there's anyone from the audience who wants to open the mic and ask questions to these 2 great ladies, just be bold and use the opportunity. It's very rare. Anyone who wants to use...
Hi, Primavera. John Wunderlich here. How are you?
Hi, very good.
That last slide with the 4, that reminds me of Larry Lessig's 4 factors, which is interesting. But I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the sociological aspects, like communications privacy management theory, and which talks in a sociological sense about selective disclosure and boundary turbulence once you've disclosed data to another individual or a group, and how you would think about data governance in that context, if that makes sense to you.
I'm not sure I'm familiar. I'm familiar with the technical side of this. I'm not sure I'm familiar with the sociological aspect of this.
It's interesting because that particular theory maps very well to a number of the business and technical rules that we talk about, but it seems to go underappreciated in the community. So, okay, thank you.
Do you want to say a few words about it?
Well, it's a theory that's derived from Goffman, but it's the notion that in sociology, privacy privacy is about what you choose to disclose to another person or to another group. And then what this theory posits is that there are rules around that disclosure, as with most sociology, and that those rules are often implicit in the group or the society, but those rules could be represented in various technological or other disclosure rules in graph theory between nodes and edges or groups of nodes and the rules of disclosure. And then when you break the rules on what you disclose, you create what's called boundary turbulence. So if I share something with you individually that I expect you not to share, and then you share it with your sister, then that creates boundary turbulence. Or if I share something in a group and then they publicize it. So it's a rule-based sociological theory that matches very well with some of the collective and individual representations of privacy that you talked about in your talk, which, by the way, I'm really looking forward to getting to that deck. It was a great talk.
Okay, I'll pick one question from this group chat, and then I'll look at the Mentimeter Kiko chat part. And this probably goes more to Catherine, but I hope the Primavera can also comment this, because there was this question about job applications and bias we get when we submit our applications. And of course, every verified data can be used as an identity. So adding on a standard procedure like skipping all your sex and gender and those background factors, just submitting. How do you see this kind of development?
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. And folks have proposed that before as a strategy for, trying to mitigate bias. And there is, there's interesting practices that arose, for example, in auditions for symphonies. I don't know if folks have seen this research where they started doing auditions behind a screen so that you couldn't see who the person was that was playing the instrument. And once they did that, the number of women who were hired jumped tremendously. So I think that's a very interesting sort of realm for that. But one of the arguments, and this is part of the double-edged sword of data when it comes to things like racism and sexism, first of all, there's a kind of issue of how do we remove all traces of gender when one's name can be inferred gender? Well, okay, we could remove the name. What about if you went to a women's college? And that's actually what the Amazon hiring algorithm was. It was demoting resumes from people that went to all women's colleges, and also people that played sports that said women's hockey and stuff like this. And so how do you remove those kinds of references to gender or participation and leadership in women's or sort of race-based affiliation groups or something like that, especially when those may indicate great things like leadership, community organizing, great project management, producing events, whatever it might be. And so I think that's tricky. And then even if we were able to surmount that in some way, there's also the question of if we are removing race and gender and other kinds of sort of protected sort of data, then that completely disables our ability to actually track disparities as well. And so one of the reasons why often we do want data, especially from a feminist perspective, is we know that oppression is real, it's ongoing. We know that racism exists and sexism exists. And one of the most powerful things is when we can gather data to quantify that and make the case that it exists. And so from that standpoint, I think, again, if we're thinking about data as this sort of accountability mechanism, it sort of disables our ability to do that and or to sort of set goals and metrics around equity-related initiatives. So it becomes a part of the strategy that I would say is prevalent in the US, which is a kind of a race-blind, gender-blind approach where we're like, okay, we're just going to pretend to not see that information, except that it's totally apparent, and so I think, my argument would be that we need to actually really face those inequalities and take them seriously, and determine accountability metrics for how we engage with them. So I don't think like trying to remove all of those markers is either possible or desirable.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll go now to the Kiko chat, and there's one simple question. Are you sharing the slides for the talk at Primavera? This one is easy to ask, to reply.
I have that question too, because her slides were amazing.
Yeah, I'm very happy to share them.
Okay, let's go to the more trickier one. Actually, we just handled this question about verified data in this job application. MyData operators, I'm sure you're aware of those, use algorithms. And Korea seems to be ahead when it comes to certifying operators. Is there a bias addressed here or other good practices? So basically, I think the question is, how can we assure, and also how can we build this governance? Who should be? Is it communities, or is it what kind of governance boards can we create? And is it like more like code of conduct? And how can we develop a more certification system to avoid biases? Who wants to? Primavera, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the whole concept of avoiding bias doesn't really make any sense. I think bias are inherent to humans and machines. And I think it's more about to which extent do we want to, like, to me, and like I look at this especially like in the context of like law and justice, and like using data and mostly like machine learning system in order to come up with like automated decision making in terms of like judiciary questions is super interesting, because on one hand, I mean, the reason that we have judges and the reason that not everyone can be a judge is because we actually recognize that the discretionary power of the judge, which is some form of subjectivity and to some extent it's like a positive bias, is good. We actually want to have people that are biased towards our own vision of justice, right? And we don't want, like, there is no, justice is not objective. So the question is more like what type of values do we want to promote, and versus which type of value do we want to bias our algorithms? And I think it's actually more interesting to look at it from like a positive sense, and it is a governance question. It's like, what do we want to train towards, right? And at the moment, I think one thing that is really interesting, and Catherine was mentioning that, is actually using those AI systems to actually detect, to analyze, and to identify the existence of bias in the current human settings, and try to then work towards reducing the bias that we don't like and maybe reinforcing the one that we do like. But when it comes to building a system, and I assume we're talking about like machine learning in this context, it's like the bias will always be there. And I don't think we even, like, I cannot even conceive what would it mean, a system with no bias. There is always like a particular function, a particular objective function that we are optimizing towards. And it's just about having more transparency about this. And to a large extent, the problem today is that we are training those algorithms over biased information, and then blaming the system for being biased, as opposed to blaming us for being biased. And to me, on the one hand, there is a lot of value in using the system as a detector, and therefore it should not be prescriptive, it should be descriptive. It should actually show us the extent to which we are actually biased, and then this can help us reduce those bias. And I think for hiring is the same thing. Like, this is actually revealing the fact that we are biased. And once we know that we are biased, we might not do it on purpose. We just are biased by inherence. And so, but once it becomes clear, once it's visible, then we can actually reinforce an alternative bias in order to compensate or try to work out those bias out of the system. So to me, it's a constant reducing and or limiting bias is actually about making those bias visible, transparent, and addressing them explicitly, and finding the one that we want to get rid of and finding the one that we consider acceptable.
Yes. And I think that it will help the more data we will make available, like this data sharing. You said that it will add value, and it will lead you to better benefits from data. And you were referring to data as an infrastructure, and then as a neutral kind of platform, or creating those more insight and having more communities and working on data. But what are the incentives? How we fuel this? And now I'm using the bad word saying fuel, but how do we motivate companies to share data? How can we ensure that those communities that develop richness in different algorithms and different use cases of data, that they have this free flow of data? Is it the government?
To me, this is why, like, this narrative, this is currently, I change my mind often, but at the moment this is my favorite narrative, and it's the data as infrastructure, because actually I don't think there is an incentive, and quite to the contrary. If data is power, there is an incentive not to share data at all. And that's why, like, I mean, antitrust has a policy. And like the essential facility doctrine, I think, is really powerful. And I think it will be very interesting to adopt this narrative of data as infrastructure so that we can actually apply those principles of antitrust law, because this is, in the end, this is antitrust. This is like the people, the actors that do hold the data, they have so much leverage. They can create so many more competitive systems. They can lock users into their model. It's actually like, it's the most anti-competitive thing is to own and control and do not share this data. And of course, it's difficult to say you should share data, because then there is all this privacy implication. And of course, we don't want data to be shared freely to anyone. And so I think it's a very delicate question, which is, there is a need. I think there is really a need, like, because we want power to be distributed, we also want data to be distributed, but at the same time, we don't want data to be disclosed. We don't want data to be unfairly exploited and so forth. And so that's where I think if we do adopt the narrative of data as infrastructure, we also need to be extremely careful about the elaboration and the design and the implementation of the infrastructure for data sharing, which will enable this power to be distributed, because many people can tap into this aggregate pool of data while maintaining all the privacy, while maintaining a mechanism of proper retribution and remuneration for the people that are actually contributing the work into the system, having a mechanism in which people can always pull off their personal data. So we need to really, like, create a system. And to me, like, those new technologies, those infrastructure, whether it's like federated learning, whether it's secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, and so forth. So the more we adopt a decentralized approach, and yet managing to aggregate the data nonetheless, then the more we actually can have this infrastructure that is compliant with data protection and privacy, and yet that also enable this redistribution of power, or at least, it's like we have like telecom operators which are forced to share their cables for competitors, because otherwise there will be no possible competition. And so in the same way, I think there is an obligation for actors like Google and Facebook and Amazon, and that just like have like incredible amount of data, they should actually let this infrastructure be used also by others, so that they can build systems on top of this underlying infrastructure without. And the problem is that today it's owned by those people, right? But if we can actually create a decentralized infrastructure in which anyone can plug the data together, because they understand that the network effect actually increase the overall data, and then you can train better algorithms, you can actually get more statistical information while maintaining the privacy and the data protection. I think then we have a possible working model. But of course, that will be a complete failure to just say, oh, data needs to be open, right? Because then, of course, there will be unfair exploitation, and there will be a very high problem in terms of confidentiality and privacy. So to me, like, the technical answer is actually part of the regulatory answer cannot be achieved without a proper technical solution.
Yeah. Very good. Catherine, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, no, I think it's a really fascinating conversation. One person who's recently been talking about digital public infrastructure is Ethan Zuckerman, who's been thinking about, like, how do we treat essentially these large network systems as digital public infrastructure? And by so doing, think about ways that will change the norms, change the regulation side of things, and so on. I think one of the tricky things, as we've been talking about this conversation, is that, and like this comes up, and this sort of also answers, there's a question here, I think, from Michael. So Michael, this may answer your question a little bit, is around how the systems that we have currently, one of the reasons that they're so flawed is they're working from the past. And so we quote Ben Green in our book, who says, machine learning, what it's actually really good at is predicting the past, not predicting the future. And so when we're always looking to the past, our past, as we know, is full of oppression, right? So for Michael was asking here, like, why would affiliation with a women's college or a women's sport make the person's resume get demoted in the system? It's because the system was trained on who are Amazon's current employees. And so if that becomes the sort of standard, Amazon has many fewer women. So it's it becomes this proxy for then selecting out the women. So it's going to be an algorithm that predicts like who most embodies this quality of being an Amazon employee. And they're going to be probably more white, more male, and so on. And I think the other thing that to navigate here, and this is where, I'm not a legal scholar, but I sometimes get tripped up with conversations around privacy, because many times, like, the model, I think, of privacy is around sort of individual harm that somebody may do to an individual. But I think one of the things that is very tricky about this space that we need to think about how to navigate is how it's not only, there's like a tricky space here between like sort of individual sort of privacy and disclosure and individual harmful effects of data systems, which I sort of told a couple examples of that. But then remembering that these are not like exactly breaches of individual privacy, they're actually group effects, right? And this is one of, I think, like the dangers of using systems where we draw conclusions by aggregating statistics about groups and then use those to make decisions about individuals. And so this is what we're seeing a lot in these artificial intelligence systems, is where we say, like, okay, here's your risk assessment score, or, oh, here's your credit score, all of these different things. What are those are drawing from are these sort of group-based characteristics. And so I think that's just another real tension to navigate in this space, is really theorizing and accounting for group harms, which is not quite the same as like group exposure of privacy, I don't think, these just sort of like racialized and gendered effects that are resulting from these systems need to be accounted for.
Yeah, if I can add something, I would say, like, I think oftentimes there is too much focus on privacy as like being the big problem, and I think more and more today it's not so much about privacy, because anyhow everyone is consenting to the treatment of their data, either by necessity or by desire. But it's really about like the extent to which these the decisions that are made by the systems are actually impinging upon individual agency. And I think that it's hard to it's actually hard today, given the current regulatory framework, to make it fall into a particular category of harm, because we actually we have many ways in which we can reduce individual agency, but none of them is taking into account the preemptivity of the system. Like, I'm preempted from doing something, so I'm not even harmed, because it's not that you're harming me, it's that you're not letting me do something, right?
Yeah, you weren't given the opportunity, right?
Exactly. And yet it's not prevented, because then that would be like, a problem. But it's like this very latent thing in which, like, I'm discriminated against. In fact, it's a form of discrimination, which is inherent into the bias of the system, for sure. And it's not privacy. It's a very different thing. Privacy can be used to fight in order to not get those data to be incorporated, but at the same time, if I don't even provide my data, I will be even further discriminated, because then they have no data, they cannot profile me, and then they will just eject me immediately. And so again, this becomes an incentive almost to provide as much data as possible in order to make sure that the system will pick us, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, this is for me why, like, one of the most exciting areas, and we talk about this in data feminism, but is thinking about how to monitor back and how to audit these systems from the outside. And so, like, sort of really trying to actively look for these kind of effects once they're happening. And because I think that's one way we highlight examples, for example, from data journalism. So, like, I think data journalism is a really interesting, especially like reporting like that's being done by folks like ProPublica and the Markup, which are here in the US, is a really interesting kind of like third-party sort of accountability work. And some of that accountability work is also happening in academia, where we see papers like the gender shades paper that's auditing facial recognition systems for gender and race bias. And so I think, like, one of the things that I would like to see is a kind of more flowering capacity building and training up of that kind of accountability work across different sectors and industries, because often these systems, or I don't know, I have very little faith that, like, corporations and governments will regulate themselves. So I think, like, if we can have this kind of culture, in a way, it's like a culture of auditing from the outside or something. But I think that kind of that can contribute to this pushback, and again, to, like, sort of making transparent the harmful effects and outputs of these systems.
Yes, I could continue this discussion for ages, but thank you both. I think we need to wrap up this. And there was one question about the comments. Maybe if you can answer it in the chat. It was in a quick chat side. But I think we all agree that data is a new fabric, and we need to have fresh concepts and fresh ideas to think about data. But what would you, Catherine, what would you advise us? What would you advise us to remember next time we think about data? Give us one advice.
One advice. I mean, well, maybe it's just what I said previously, like sort of thinking about how do we monitor back. We talk about the idea in the book of counter data collection, talk about these ideas around auditing algorithms. I think these are really important, and those are not only steps. You know, I tend to work more outside of institutions, so like working with activist groups and nonprofits and community organizations and things like this. But I think these are steps that can also be taken inside large organizations, where you sort of have a culture of facing your structural biases, which almost no large organization has that culture, but maybe some can start. And really looking carefully about, how does power show up in the institution's own operations, and consequently in its products and in its data systems and in its algorithms and so on. And what are the harmful differential effects of that? And then how do we mitigate those? I mean, I think like that, but that is it's a culture that needs to be cultivated. It's not only a technical method of like, here's step 1, 2, 3 of how do you de-bias your algorithm or something.
Okay, and Primavera, what's your number 1 tip for us all?
I don't think I have one, but yeah, I think maybe it's like, one thing I said already about like, I think all those questions cannot be answered without coming up with an actual practical and like whether it's regulatory. Like I think it's really nice to think about those metaphors, but it's not just about the beauty and the saliency of the metaphor. We need to think about the implication, the performative action that those metaphors have on society, and mostly like from social and political and legal terms. And I think that really thinking about, if we do think about data as power, then it becomes easier to answer the question of where do we want data to be, right? Like who do we want to hold power, and hence who do we want to hold this data? We don't want power to be held in those centralized data centers. We want power to be distributed, hence we want data to be distributed. We want power to be to be in the hand of the individual, meaning that we want the individual to have control over this data as well, So I think this analogy, like this metaphor, is enabling us, and the same thing with infrastructure. If we think of data as infrastructure, we want it to be accessible. We want to be accessible to people to run their own services on top of it, So it's really about like going further, going deeper into this metaphorical analysis of like, why are we choosing this metaphor rather than the other? And it's usually for a political reason, right? And I think like data as power and data as infrastructure are really powerful in a political sense because they lead us to think about data in a way that forces us to think about solution in the same way as we're trying to find a solution in the physical space in the real world with infrastructure and with power and with power distribution.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this great session. And I really encourage our audience to go now to the Kiko chat and leave some feedback about the session. It helps us to improve. And it seems that our audience, it's like very modest voting on Mentimeter, but sun and zeros and ones are the most common things thought when people think about data. So it seems that we have very analytical and optimistic people joining this session. So let's keep up the good spirit and thank you. I really enjoyed, and I hope that you enjoyed as well, in the audience. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.